Picture a warship, sleek, fast, bristling with menace, slicing through the water at 40 miles an hour. Now imagine the Navy that built it spent around $500 million on each one, $500 million for a single ship. And then imagine the people who designed it, the admirals who championed it, the government that paid for it, were forced to admit a quietly devastating truth about these gleaming machines.
The Navy goes to Congress and says, we want to retire ships. All Congress wants to think about is, we already are short on ships. Why are you getting rid of more ships?
They could not fight. Not they were not the best. Not they had a few teething problems. The Navy's own testing concluded that these warships were, in a real battle against a serious enemy, not survivable. A vessel built for combat that the military itself decided could not safely go into combat, and the country did not build one or two of them, it built dozens. This is the story of how one of the most powerful navies on Earth spent more than $20 billion building a fleet of warships so troubled that sailors gave them a cruel nickname, and so unreliable that the Navy began scrapping them when some were barely 5 years old, younger than a child in primary school. And the most astonishing part is not that it failed. It is that the warning signs were screaming from the very beginning, and the ships kept getting built anyway, long after almost everyone involved knew the dream was dead. So how does that happen? How do you keep building a warship that cannot fight? Stay with me, because this is not really a story about ships. This is the Littoral Combat Ship.
The LCS is designed for littoral areas, which is water closer to shore.
It's a zero-sum game, okay? Every dollar you spend to keep those LCSs going is a dollar you can't spend on these other, I think, higher priorities.
To understand the scale of the waste, hold this in your mind. The amount poured into this single program, over $20 billion, is more than the entire annual defense budget of many countries. It is enough to have built a whole fleet of genuinely capable warships, or funded years of other vital military needs. Instead, it bought a class of vessels that the Navy itself would come to describe, in effect, as ships built for a world that no longer existed. Here is the thing you have to understand before any of the money makes sense. This is not a story about engineers being stupid. The people who build warships for a living are some of the most capable on the planet. This is a story about what happens when a beautiful idea collides with reality, fails, and a system so large, with so many jobs and reputations attached, simply cannot bring itself to stop. And it begins with a genuinely brilliant vision. To understand it, you have to go back to the years after the Cold War. For decades, the great navies of the world had been built to fight each other. Enormous destroyers and cruisers, floating fortresses designed for vast battles on the open ocean. But by the early 2000s, the threats had changed. The new dangers were smaller and closer to shore. Fast little attack boats, quiet diesel submarines lurking near coastlines, mines hidden in shallow water. And the Navy's giant warships were like heavyweight boxers being asked to win a knife fight in a phone box. Too big, too slow, too expensive to risk in those tight coastal waters. So the Navy dreamed up something new. A small, fast, nimble warship that could dart into those shallow coastal zones, the littoral zones, hence the name, and handle whatever it found there. And here was the truly clever part, the idea that got everyone so excited. It would be modular. Like a smartphone where you swap out the apps, this ship would have swappable mission packages. One week, you could fit it out to hunt submarines. The next, swap in different equipment and send it to clear mines. Swap again, and it is hunting surface ships. One hull, many missions. A Swiss Army knife of the seas. And on paper, it was glorious. It would be cheap. The early promise was around $220 million per ship, a bargain by warship standards. It would be fast, hitting speeds few warships could match. It would be lean, run by a tiny crew. The Navy was so confident, it planned to build a whole fleet of them, dozens upon dozens, the affordable backbone of the future.
The Navy ended up producing two variants of the LCS, the Freedom class and Independence class. The Freedom class is a more traditional steel and aluminum ship, and the Independence class is an all-aluminum, trimaran-style design.
To get them built quickly, it even ran two different shipbuilders at once, each producing its own competing design. And that decision to run two shipbuilders at once, to hedge its bets by backing two completely different designs, would come back to haunt the Navy. The plan had been to eventually pick a winner. Instead, both designs ended up being built. That meant two entirely different types of ship, with two different sets of spare parts, two different sets of problems to solve, and two different crews to train. The Navy had not built one troubled warship. It had, in effect, committed to two of them at the same time, doubling the complexity and the cost of every headache that followed. But beneath that brilliant vision, a crack was already forming. And it came from trying to make one ship do absolutely everything. Because here is the trouble with a Swiss Army knife. It is a marvel of convenience, but the little blade is never as good as a real knife. And the tiny scissors are never as good as real scissors. A tool that does everything tends to do nothing exceptionally well. And a warship is not a pocket gadget. The compromises needed to make one small hull switch between hunting submarines, clearing mines, and fighting ships meant that, in trying to be ready for anything, it risked being truly excellent at nothing. And that beautiful modular idea, the swappable mission packages that were the whole selling point, turned out to be fiendishly difficult in practice. Swapping a ship's entire combat purpose was not as simple as changing an app. It was slow, complicated, and the packages themselves were plagued with problems and delays. The single feature that made the Littoral Combat Ship special was the very feature that refused to work as promised. And this is where the story stops being about a clever design and starts being about a machine that simply broke. Because once these ships actually hit the water, the problems were not subtle. They were the kind of failures that leave a warship sitting helplessly still in the open ocean. The two designs each had their own crippling flaw. One class suffered repeated failures in a critical piece of machinery deep in its propulsion system, the gear that let it switch between its engines. When it broke, and it broke more than once, the ship was left dead in the water, a $500 million vessel unable to move under its own power. The other class, built with a lightweight aluminium hull to make it fast, developed cracks. Cracks in the hull of a ship are not a small matter. They are the thing that, at the extreme, lets the sea in.
The current fleet of small surface combatants, which right now that brings some real capability in the littorals where a large carrier battle group can't get to.
The ship that was supposed to slice elegantly through the waves was, in some cases, being damaged by the very act of sailing fast through them. And the breakdowns were so frequent and the repairs so constant that the ships spent staggering amounts of time not at sea, where warships are supposed to be, but in port, being fixed. Sailors, with the dark humor that sailors always have, started calling them names. Officially, they were littoral combat ships. Unofficially, the crews who served on them had a blunter title, the little crappy ships. Some joked the initials really stood for the dry dock they were always sitting in. But the breakdowns were not even the most damning part, because the deepest problem was not that they kept breaking. It was what the Navy's own experts concluded about what would happen if one of these ships ever had to do the single thing it was built for: fight. In 2013, the Pentagon's own testing office delivered a verdict that should have ended the entire program on the spot. It judged that both versions of the Littoral Combat Ship were not survivable in a high-intensity combat environment. Read that again, slowly. The organization responsible for testing America's weapons looked at these warships and concluded that in a real fight against a capable enemy, they would not be expected to survive. To keep costs and weight down, the ships had been built lightly armored and lightly armed, carrying little more than guns and short-range defensive missiles. A warship that could not win a war. A combat vessel that could not safely enter combat. And this verdict did not land in a vacuum. While the Navy was wrestling with warships that broke down and could not survive a fight, the strategic picture was shifting beneath its feet. A rising naval power on the other side of the world was rapidly expanding its own fleet, building large numbers of capable warships and developing exactly the kind of coastal defenses designed to keep vessels like these far from its shores. The Littoral Combat Ship had been conceived for chasing pirates and small boats in lightly contested waters. The world it now found itself in was one of serious competition between great naval powers. A contest these lightly armed, frequently broken ships were never built to win. The mission they were designed for was fading, and the mission that was emerging was one they could not perform. So how much did this cost? Let's lay it out, because the number climbed at every stage. Remember the original promise, around $220 million per ship. That was the figure that sold the program, that made it look like a bargain. But as the redesigns piled up and the problems multiplied, that price more than doubled. By the time the ships were actually being delivered, each one cost somewhere around $500 million. And some, once you added in their mission equipment, ran past $600 million. More than twice what was promised for a ship that could not fight. And that is just the price of building them. Each one also costs around $70 million every single year just to operate and maintain. An enormous ongoing bill for a vessel spending so much of its life in repair. Add it all together across the whole fleet that was eventually built, and the total program cost swelled to more than $20 billion. Say it slowly. That's 10 zeros. And someone signed off on every single one.
People ask me about Littoral Combat Ship. Is it a new cruiser or destroyer? Actually, it's neither. It's an entirely new category of warship.
But here is the detail that turns an expensive failure into something genuinely hard to believe. The Navy did not keep these ships for the decades a warship is meant to serve. It began retiring them early, astonishingly early. The very first 2 ships of the program were pulled from service after just 13 and 11 years. One ship, the Sioux City, was decommissioned after only about 5 years in the water. Think about that. A warship that cost $500 million to build retired before it was old enough to start school. By one analysis, scrapping these ships early represented a loss of around $7 billion in vessels the Navy had bought and then simply gave up on. And the reasoning behind retiring them only deepens the absurdity. The Navy worked out that bringing some of the earliest ships up to any kind of useful standard would cost so much, billions more on top of everything already spent, that it was simply not worth it. It was cheaper to throw away a nearly new $500 million warship than to fix it. When the maths of a brand new ship says scrap it rather than mend it, you are no longer looking at a vessel. You are looking at a mistake too expensive to keep. By now, you might be asking the obvious question. If the ships did not work, if the Navy's own testers said they could not survive a fight, why on earth keep them at all? Why not stop years earlier? And the answer is the same trap that swallows so many of these stories. By the time the failures were undeniable, billions had already been spent. Stopping would mean standing up in public and admitting that all that money had bought a fleet that could not fight. And that is an admission almost no institution wants to make. So instead, the spending continued, and the ships kept coming. Each one another $500 million committed to a dream the Navy was quietly burying. So how does a story like this end? Not with a bang, with the slow, awkward dismantling of a dream the Navy had already stopped believing in. And here is the part that captures the whole absurdity in a single image. Even as the Navy was busily decommissioning these ships, towing relatively new, $500 million warships off to be scrapped, it was, at the very same time, still finishing and commissioning brand new ones. In 2026, the Navy welcomed the final ship of the program into service, holding a proud ceremony for a vessel belonging to a class it was simultaneously sending to the scrapyard. The factory was still building the dream at one end, while the Navy buried it at the other. So how did this happen? How do you keep building warships that cannot fight, long after you know they cannot fight? The answer has very little to do with engineering, and everything to do with how enormous projects develop a life of their own. The original idea was not foolish. The world really had changed, and the Navy really did need new kinds of ships. But once the program began, it became a machine far harder to stop than to start. 2 shipyards were now building these vessels, employing thousands of workers in towns that depended on the work. Contracts had been signed. Careers had been staked on the program's success. And so, when the problems mounted and the cost doubled, and the Navy's own testers declared the ships unsurvivable, killing the program outright became politically and practically almost impossible. Lawmakers fought to keep the orders flowing, to protect the jobs in their communities. The ships kept getting built, not because they worked, but because too much now depended on building them. This is the quiet tragedy behind so many of these stories. The Littoral Combat Ship was not sunk by a single catastrophic blunder. It was sunk by ambition that outran reality, by the refusal to demand that a tool which promised to do everything actually prove it could do anything, and by a system so heavy with jobs and money and pride that it could not change course even when everyone could see the rocks ahead. It kept sailing toward them, $500 million at a time. The Navy set out to build a cheap, fast, flexible warship for a new era. What it got, in the end, was an expensive lesson in a timeless truth, that a thing built to do everything will often, when it matters most, do nothing at all. No sides, no politics, just the receipts. Count the zeros.